Hi, everyone. I think we can get started now. Thanks again for joining today's webinar hosted by Justin Weissig. He is a Senior Technical Product Marketing Manager here at HashiCorp. And today he's going to provide us an overview of the cloud operating model and share how Vault provides the foundation for security in multi-cloud environments. We're going to spend the last 15 minutes of the webinar dedicated to a live Q&A. I also wanted to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded, and we will have that recording made available to you after post-processing. That usually takes about a day or two, and I will send that over email after. Feel free to put your questions in the box as we go through the presentation, and I'll aggregate all of those, and then we can go through them towards the end in the Q&A. I think with that, we can go ahead and get started. So off to you, Justin.
Awesome, thanks, Ed. Before we dive in, let me quickly introduce myself. So as Ed mentioned, my name is Justin Wazik, and I'm on the technical marketing team here at HashiCorp, focusing on Vault. Before working here, I was a sysadmin for 10 plus years, and then I worked at a major cloud provider helping large companies adopt cloud. So the theme for today's webinar will be working through the high-level logistical realities that many companies go through when adopting cloud. And we'll focus on secrets management tools and more broadly, how to wrangle the sprawl of secrets across your infrastructure. We'll expand on this too and sort of work through it together, but the general idea is, how do you cope with going from a pretty static environment, like a single data center, to something highly dynamic, like using multiple clouds? So here's the agenda for today's talk. I thought it might be useful to quickly cover a little bit about HashiCorp and the products we create. Next, I wanted to quickly cover at a high level what we're going to be calling the cloud operating model. Basically, this is sort of a blueprint for companies looking to adopt cloud, and it covers many of the things that you'll need to think about along that journey. Next, we'll jump into the ins and outs of Vault, along with some of the practical use cases that are related to this cloud operating model. This should give you a good idea of how Vault can really help you and your company not only to move towards, say, a better security posture, but how you can actually streamline a lot of internal workflows and how you can interact with your secrets. Finally, at the end of the webinar, for those watching live, as Ed mentioned, we've made some time for a live Q&A session. So you can just pop your questions into the little questions box here, and we'll work through them at the end. All right, let's get started. So HashiCorp is a company that was founded in 2012 with a focus on sort of core infrastructure automation tools. We've been growing really quickly. We're up to about 700 employees today. We're also hiring like crazy. So if you're interested in any of this type of stuff, I'd definitely encourage you to check out our jobs postings. You can see over on the right here, we make 6 products. And chances are, if you've been working in the operations space, most likely you've interacted with at least one of these tools. For example, Terraform is great for sort of automating your infrastructure. A lot of developers have used Vagrant for spinning up quick sort of development environments. Obviously Vault, which we're going to be chatting about today, Consul, and Nomad. However, you might be thinking, this company sort of makes a bunch of tools that solve a bunch of unique problems in their own areas. How are they all connected, and sort of what's the theme here? Well, that's a good question. And this is where the cloud operating model comes in. Each of these tools addresses sort of a different layer of the operation stack. So let me show you what I'm talking about. And this might sort of explain my mental model of how I think about things. So this diagram helps to explain sort of how these infrastructure automation tools actually fit together. So down at the bottom here, you can see at the provisioning layer, we have Terraform. Terraform is awesome for sort of codifying how your infrastructure in the cloud should look. So for example, hey, I want a 3-tier web application. You can go and pop all that into, say, a configuration file. Once you have all that set up, you might have your applications, and these applications are going to need lots of secret data, like usernames and passwords, API keys, certificates. How do you securely store all that stuff? Next level up, we have networking. This is with Consul. Okay, I have my applications up. How do they actually chat with each other? Finally, we have Nomad, which is like an application orchestration tool, which also does containers. You can see it does a variety of different executables. And so even though these are sort of 4 unique products, they do fit together when you think of it sort of in this logical model. All right. We've actually published a 19-page white paper. Let me just jump out of the presentation here for a sec, because I think this will explain a lot of sort of the context around this. If you can find it just by going to Google and you type in like cloud operating model, and this will pop up. It's a great reference. Say, for example, if you're running on-prem and you're looking to go to cloud, this will sort of walk you through a lot of the different things you need to think about in those sort of 4 key areas. Hey, I'm provisioning. How do I handle secrets? Lots of diagrams in here. I'm not going to go through this right now because you can probably go through this on your own time, and I think you'll get more benefit out of it. So let's go back to the presentation here. So what are some examples of where secrets, of where we can sort of utilize this secrets layer here, since that's the topic of today's chat? So for many enterprises, cloud adoption often requires a shift from traditional on-prem static infrastructure with clearly defined network parameters to cloud infrastructure that is highly dynamic and doesn't have clear network parameters. Say, for example, you have a data center and you have a 3-tier web application. You might actually have hardware dedicated to those 3 different tiers. They have some web servers. They have static IP addresses with static host names. They never change. And then you have dedicated firewall rules that direct traffic to a bunch of application servers, and those application servers talk to databases. And you can get away with just hard coding a lot of that stuff because it never changes. But that model totally falls apart when you go to shift to the cloud because it's highly dynamic. IP addresses are constantly changing. Your pools of those various compute resources are constantly going up and down. And so it becomes a lot harder to sort of clearly define what that means. So this helps maybe explain it a little bit better. So for many companies, they want to take advantage of on-demand compute that the cloud offers. Also, releasing yourself from the continual hardware lifecycle can be extremely attractive. Say, for example, you own your own data center and you're buying hardware every 3 years. You're racking, stacking, cabling, and labeling, all that stuff versus just using a cloud provider. So offloading a lot of this sort of work to cloud providers makes sense. But the shift from static infrastructure to highly dynamic infrastructure often requires a fundamentally different approach to security, as we sort of chatted about. Instead of focusing on a secure network parameter with the assumption of trust, sort of the focus is to acknowledge that the network in the cloud is inherently low trust and sort of move to a mental model of securing infrastructure and applications themselves through a trusted source of identity and secrets management. That's where Vault comes in. I guess what I'm getting at here is that oftentimes the patterns that you've been working with sort of need to be updated to take into account cloud. So let's have a deeper look at that. So as you can see, this doesn't only have implications on security though. The 4 different products here sort of highlight what we're talking about. But things are often more complicated since your operations staff now need to adapt for these multiple environments, right? So on the provisioning side down here at the bottom for Terraform, you might have had your pools of dedicated infrastructure, you have your build scripts and away you go. But on the cloud, this is on demand and they can spin up and down. So you need a way to deal with that, especially if it goes across cloud providers. Say, for example, you're using AWS and GCP. How do you clearly define these build scripts? So that's where tools like Terraform really come into play. Same thing goes for security. We're moving from IP-based to identity-based. Say, for example, you're using IAM on AWS and maybe AD on Azure. How do you sort of cope with that? So here's a few examples. Say one team might be using AWS and another Azure, plus you still have your dedicated on-prem infrastructure. how do you maintain a consistent workflow across all these platforms? Especially since one might be using, like I mentioned, AD or GCP IAM or AWS IAM. And maybe some of these tools need to chat back to your network. It can become complicated really quickly. So what's the answer here? Well, that's sort of where Vault comes into play. Vault enables teams to securely store and tightly control access to tokens, password certificates, and encryption keys for protecting machines, applications, and sensitive data. Basically, Vault allows you to centrally manage and securely store secrets across on-prem infrastructure and cloud infrastructure using a single system. Using a single system is sort of the key concept here, in that it allows you to develop, it allows your developers and applications to sort of use a single workflow, since we can interface with a single system. So you can almost think of Vault as an abstraction that sits on top of these cloud providers, and then it has sort of, we call them providers, but they're sort of, you can think of them almost like plugins that will integrate with your cloud providers. And then, you can use Vault to chat with them. Maybe I'll change to the next slide because this probably will make a lot more sense here. So a key concept here is what we call identity brokering and identity-based access. So with Vault, you have the ability to create dynamic secrets per service. And this has several benefits. Secrets can be short-lived, specific secrets can be revoked in the event of a breach, and all actions are audited per secret. Each cloud service can be given access to secrets based on their identity and have sort of a policy associated with it. So rather than, identifying applications based on, say, firewall rules or host names of, hey, you know what, this is a web server that's, lives in this IP block and it's authorized to chat with a database or application servers. Now we've totally abstracted that concept, and we can say, you know what, your identity is a web server. It doesn't matter what your IP address is anymore. Is this identity allowed to access these particular secrets that we're looking for? So how's this different from running in a static environment? Well, sort of as I just mentioned, before you might have been using host names, IP addresses, firewall rules, and all of this becomes a lot simpler, especially when you're moving to the cloud, when you change to an identity-based system. This is really one of the key driving concepts behind Vault. Another thing that you have to think about is we chat with a lot of organizations of all sizes about their infrastructure plans and adoption of the cloud operating model as they navigate this transition to the cloud. As this migration has taken place, some organizations can struggle with the discovery of this sprawl of secrets and access credentials sprinkled throughout their infrastructure. So here's a sort of a few examples of what this secret sprawl can look like. As I mentioned, we have hard-coded host names, firewall rules used to identify applications. There's a lot of plain text username and passwords embedded in scripts. Sort of a personal story here is, when I was a sysadmin, it's just easy to do this. You're doing it all the time. Your developers are doing it, sysadmins are doing it because they don't have better options. And, especially if you're in a large company, you probably have pockets of IT all over the place. All these different groups are sort of implementing their own policies and procedures. So you might have backup scripts that have a hard-coded username and password so they can dump the database. There's also a highly privileged cloud provider API key sitting in source code, or maybe environment variables. These things often get uploaded to, say, GitHub. It's like almost every other month you read some story about how cloud infrastructure was compromised because someone accidentally uploaded their API keys. You have certificates and encryption keys stored unencrypted. The list goes on and on. So this sort of brings up the use case of Vault. Using Vault, you can centrally store, access, and distribute these dynamic secrets across applications, systems, and infrastructure. Basically, without using a secrets management tool, you most likely have this secret sprawl happening that we just chatted about. This leads to productivity losses, as each team typically needs to reinvent the wheel. As I sort of mentioned, you're going to have these pockets of IT, And if there's no clear single system or workflow for interacting with this sort of secret data, each team is sort of going to be inventing their own way of dealing with it. Especially if you have, say, in a large enterprise, you probably have different groups that prefer different clouds. You might have one on, say, Azure and one on AWS. And maybe your company goes and acquires another company and they're using GCP. It wasn't that you necessarily even wanted to use GCP, but all of a sudden now you find yourself in a situation where you're using 3 different cloud providers. How do you maintain a consistent workflow across those 3? This is sort of where using a secret management tool is just critical. As you're going to have productivity losses as you're reinventing the wheel. It's going to increase the cost since you have lots of redundant systems, and it also heavily increases your risk because each team is sort of responsible for their own security. So sort of the solution here is obviously, as I just mentioned, using a secrets management tool. It increases the productivity since you now have a central tool and a sort of a central workflow that you can sort of point everyone at and say, you know what, here's how you interact with secrets data. You can sort of control the cost, especially with compliance and meeting policy objectives. It also reduces your risk because you can use, we didn't chat about it yet, but Vault has the concept of dynamic secrets, where these are sort of single-use secrets or time-to-live secrets that will auto-expire. So even if an application actually accidentally, say, leaks a secret, there's a shelf life on that secret. Also, any access to Vault can be audited and logged, so you can have that, say, exported to Splunk, and then you can go through and audit all that stuff. I just sort of wanted to chat about how Vault is packaged too. So Vault is an open source project up on GitHub, but it also has enterprise features. So say, for example, a lot of folks will start on the journey of trying out open source, and then all of a sudden they realize, especially if you're, say, an enterprise customer, hey, we'd like support, and we also want a lot of the enterprise features like high availability and, say, disaster recovery and additional policy type stuff. That's sort of where these additional modules come into play. This is sort of some of the enterprise stuff that we just chatted about, replication, disaster recovery, control groups, where you can have sort of very detailed policy that says, hey, you know what, if this person wants to do this particular action, they need to check with another group or something like that, or have them approve it. Same thing with, maybe you want to interact with HSM on-prem or something like that. So that sort of covers my introduction to Vault and the cloud operating model. But what I'd really like to do is sort of point you, one sec here, let me switch over to this cloud operating model document. If you haven't seen this before, I'd highly recommend just checking this out, as it's a great reference. It's 19 pages, so it might take you, a half an hour to go through or something like that, but I'd say it's definitely worth it if you're checking this out. There's also another white paper called Unlocking the Cloud Operating Model specifically for security. So you can think sort of, as we chatted about those 4 different products, there's a particular white paper that basically dives into each one of those. And then, this one focuses heavily on security. There's a couple other links I wanted to show you. So here's the Vault open source project. You can see it's super popular. We have tons of contributors. There's constantly new features being rolled out, and especially since there's such a big community, we have lots of feedback on particular use cases and can bake the ideas pretty well. Finally, I also wanted to mention, if you prefer sort of video content, if you go search on YouTube for the cloud operating model, you'll find a video with Dave McJanet, which is our CEO, where he sort of walks through the cloud operating model, sort of taking in the big picture view of the 4 different products. Finally, before we kick it into the Q&A session, I also wanted to mention, if you haven't checked it out, we have an awesome Learn website. If you're not familiar with Vault at all and you just want to get started, there's sort of lots of different labs you can go through that sort of show you at the command line how to actually work with Vault. Also, if you're, say, like a experienced Vault user and you're looking for maybe reference architectures or something like that, you can also use the Learn site, and they have just a ton of information on there. All right, so that's, let me flip back to the presentation here. I'll post all these links so you can have a look. So I'd like to thanks very much for following along. And I think we'll kick it back to Ed and we'll start the Q&A session. And then here's the reference links for anyone interested. I also think we'll probably be sending this out via email, but just in case. All right, back to you, Ed.
Hey, thanks, Justin. So yeah, like you mentioned, just wanted to reiterate since we've had this question come up a couple of times in the chat. We will be sending out the recording and the slides as well after the presentation. So our team usually takes about a day or two to go through post-processing for the videos, but once that's over, we'll definitely share those resources with you all. So now that we're in the Q&A, feel free to ask your questions in the little questions box here within GoToWebinar, and we'll go through as many as we can in the rest of the time. Thank you.
Cool. Sorry, I'll just start going through the questions here. All right, so there's a question about who will be integrating Vault with different clouds. Maybe it's a little bit ambiguous, but I might sort of say, if you're, it really depends on your organization. So say if you're like a small startup and you're born in the cloud, you might have like a small, say group of like DevOps engineers. They're typically responsible for sort of setting up Vault. And then you might work with your developers to sort of say, here's the pattern for how you integrate with Vault. If you work at a large, say, enterprise company, say you have like 10,000 employees with like, developers in North America and Europe and Asia, what I've sort of seen happen is you'll have a sort of a central platforms team or something like that. Typically, they'll be the ones responsible for Vault, and then they'll issue patterns of how you integrate with Vault. So I think that's a roundabout way of maybe answering your question, but that's how typically I've seen it happen. All right, the next one here is currently open source user Terraform. Can someone provide me more details on the pros and cons of using it and how much value we're able to attain using enterprise? That's a pretty good question, but it's probably answered better by a different team. So what I'll do is I'll probably forward that question on and we'll get someone to answer that for you from the Terraform team, since they'll have a much better answer than what I'll give you today. What's the cost of the enterprise version? I think it varies depending on what modules you want to enable, but also it probably depends on your usage and all that kind of stuff. I actually don't have a good answer for that. If you want, I could connect you with someone who would just give you the number, but off the top of my head, I don't know because it varies so much. Does Vault require root encryption to be provided by the underlying cloud provider? So Vault encrypts all the data at rest and in transit. So it doesn't necessarily, you don't need to worry about the underlying, say, cloud provider providing encryption for your data, as Vault does it itself. And plus there's a variety of backends. So we didn't really chat about it, but Vault, you can think of Vault as a server. Obviously, it has like a data store where it's actually storing all this secret data that you're putting into it. And so, you can use console. We just released a Raft version where it has internal storage. You could use a database. And so since there's a variety of different backends, Vault actually handles all of the encryption. And then when it puts that data into the data store, it's all encrypted using the same method. So we don't rely on any of the underlying cloud providers to do any of that. Is data encrypted in transit between client server? Yes, all data is encrypted, at rest and in transit, so you don't need to worry about that. Is there plans to do a more technical talk? I think, yeah, if you're interested, like if you just want to, I don't know the person who asked this question, but if you just want to maybe throw a little bit more details on like what you're looking for, we can definitely schedule that. What's the recommended deployment model, for using on-prem GCP Azure in K8 clusters? That's a good question. What you can do is if you just go to Google and you type in, say, like Vault K8 architecture or Vault Kubernetes architecture, you'll come up with at the Learn site, and it gives you a default architecture. My typical go-to is that I don't actually recommend, say, like a particular architecture for a specific, say, cloud provider. What I do is say, check out the general architecture, that you'll pull up by typing like Vault Kubernetes reference architecture. And then you can tailor that to your own environment of, whether you're in GCP, Azure, or AWS, because it makes a lot more sense like that way to sort of start at that, the recommended architecture, and then sort of adapt it for your environment. But yeah. I think that's it for questions here. Let me see if anything else pops in. Okay, so just to follow up on the person who asked about more technical talks, they're sort of interested in using Vault to generate credentials in a CI/CD pipeline. I think that's definitely something that would be interesting to a lot of people, and yeah, we can definitely do that. Might even be useful to maybe do a blog post or something, but I'll take that offline on my end, and I'll work on that. So is there any references or repositories for Vault plugins to use databases like SQL Server or DB2? Let me just pop out of the presentation and I'll show you the Vault website here, as that probably makes a lot more sense. Vault. Let me just go to the Vault website here. If you go into the Vault docs, you can see plugin backends. Where are we looking at here? Sorry, I'm just looking at, for the storage area. Agent, secret engine, auth. Unfortunately, I can't find it at the moment, but there is a whole section in here that will talk about, say, storage backends, and it will give you, an overview of using, a variety of different databases and, console and stuff like that. So basically my answer here is just check out the docs and you'll find it. Yeah. All right, what's the difference between S3 storage and Vault? S3 and other services have their own security features. I guess, are you talking about the storage backend for Vault? I think, generally when I think about sort of storage backends for Vault, so maybe just give the bigger picture here. So as we mentioned before, Vault is a awesome centralized place to store all your secrets. And since those secrets are being stored, we need a place to actually store them. So you have a variety of different options of, like S3 storage, databases, console, RAF storage. Why do we provide so much? Well, it really depends on sort of the customer's use cases. But the way I think about it is it really would depend on how often you're sort of hitting these. Are you constantly writing secrets? Are you constantly reading them? If you're only reading, say, 10 requests a second versus another customer who wants to read like 50,000 requests a second. Your backend storage requirements are going to be totally different. You're going to want something that's, probably highly available, scales really easily, has a bunch of different requirements of how you can monitor and log and instrument your backend data store. So, you sort of need to, that's why we have a variety of different ones, and that you can highly tailor that to sort of your own environment. So I think that's a roundabout way of answering your question about what's the difference between S3 and the other ones, is that it would really fit your use case. I think we've answered most of these questions now. Let's just see if anything else comes in. All right. Unless we get another, say, question or two in the next, say, a couple of minutes, I think we'll just close it out. There is a question about Terraform Cloud versus, I think what I'll do is I'll take that offline and I'll get the Terraform team to connect with you on that one. Just since, it probably makes more sense they can point you at all the awesome resources. I sort of focus on Vault, and I'm not like, they can just provide you with a much better answer on in terms of Terraform Cloud. Yeah, so there's a question about, say your application is deployed worldwide. Is there a caching mechanism to access secrets, or is it only centralized? So the sort of general answer is no, it's not centralized in that case, in that, you can deploy sort of replicated Vault clusters in your region. Say for example, I don't know, you're a gaming company and you have users deployed all over the world. You have North America, you have Asia and Europe. And, when sort of North America is going to sleep, Europe comes online and they're all gaming like crazy. You don't want them going across the ocean, hitting a central Vault cluster in North America or something like that, right? It's just going to introduce latency. So we have the concept of setting up replicated Vault clusters. So you can have a replicated cluster sitting in, say, North America or Europe or Asia, wherever your sort of compute infrastructure lives. And that way, that greatly decreases sort of latency, and you can get super high performance out of that. So yeah, that's an enterprise feature, but that definitely is something that tons of customers use. Same thing goes, just to sort of dovetail onto that, especially for disaster recovery, if one of those clusters goes down, you can automatically like fail over into another cluster. So there's like multiple benefits of having these sort of replicated clusters. We'll just we'll see if there's any more questions here. I'd say thanks for all the questions. These are great. All right, Ed, I think that's pretty much it. I want to thank everyone for joining the call today, especially popping your questions in here. For the two questions that were around Terraform and Terraform Cloud, we'll definitely make sure to follow up with you folks. All right, thanks very much.
Yeah, just one last thing to mention. As I mentioned at the beginning as well, like we will be sending the recording and the slides in a couple of days, so just watch out for that. And if you have any other questions, specific things that we might not have responded to here, feel free to send those over to us as well. I think you all have our information from the link you get from signing up for the webinar. But if you need our email, my email is edfarraye@hashicorp.com. So EDFARRAYE@hashicorp.com. So if you have any other follow-up questions, feel free to send those directly to me, and we'll try to get those answers to you as soon as possible. Thanks again for joining the webinar, and we hope to see you for a future one very soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much. See you guys.